The world is in a race to reduce carbon emissions. Scientists estimate that the buildings we live, work, and shop in are responsible for 36% of all global emissions and 40% of all energy consumption. That's why the European Union created the Energy Performance Certificate, or EPC. The EU's goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 60% by 2030 compared to 2015 levels. To make that happen, all commercial buildings have to achieve a C rating by 2027 and a B rating by 2030. This is going to be very tough for a lot of owners and very expensive. And it's not just that owners who don't make it risk getting fined. Banks are increasingly unwilling to finance buildings that don't make that grade. Investors will only buy them at a discount that reflects the cost of the necessary investments. This episode of The Prime Pod takes a deep dive into the situation, which is getting serious in a hurry. I'm really pleased to be partnering with the Savills office in Prague on this one. Together, we put together an expert group of property professionals who deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis. I'm joined for this episode by Jan Juricek, who is head of building and project consultancy for Savills. Roland Bebchak is country manager of the asset manager White Star, and Ian Fanthorpe is country manager of Blue House Capital. My name is Robert McLean, and I'm your host for the Prime Pod.
Gentlemen, let's explore how the market is adapting to these new realities and what solutions might emerge from this period of transition. Roland, I thought we'd start with you. Maybe you could explain what it is White Star does and how you're approaching this issue of upgrading and maintaining the assets that you take care of to make sure that they're compatible with the new carbon reduction regulations.
Maybe just a word about White Star. So basically, we are representing many investors across the whole world, starting with US, UK, European Union, and Asia. We have over 500,000 square meters under our management within Czech Republic and Slovakia. So basically, we have a wide range of assets where we kind of experience this issue we just mentioned. And we have to take many approaches depending on each and every client. But overall, we see a huge push from all the investors to be compliant with the new regulations which are coming from European Union and also that are to be implemented in the Czech law. So basically, we try to investigate what are the minimum necessities to make sure that basically the building will be compliant. And we see the two main risks which you indicated. So basically, how the assets are going to be financed in the future by external debt, and what is their potential at exit to reach the value that the investors would like to see at their paycheck when they sell the building. Mm-hmm. So basically, it's just the investigation and implementation and advisory to our clients what they need to do.
Okay. Give us an idea of the type of assets you're taking that you're looking after at the moment. Age is obviously quite an important issue in all of these matters.
When speaking about commercial real estate at the moment, I think the most crucial will be the office segment at the moment. So basically, we have assets under our management, let's say 5 to 25 years of age, and it's quite different approach you have to take for the new assets, which are more kind of getting better scoring when it comes to EPC, BREEAM certification or LEED certification. And the older assets are having these difficulties, specifically when speaking about EPC, which is the main driver for the banks and also for the investors, how they are going to decide whether the building is financeable or not. So the older the assets are, the toughest actually is the investment that needs to be made into the property to be still compliant with certain scoring which the building needs to have. Mm-hmm. So mainly I think we will be speaking today about the assets which are going to be, let's say, 10, 15 years and older, which is the majority of stock within Prague real estate. And I think we will get into a deep discussion soon, but I think it's going to be a real problem in upcoming years.
Okay. Ian, talk to us a little bit about Blue House Capital and the assets you're managing and your approach to these issues.
Sure. Yeah, as basically a cross-sector investor, we have a very broad range of assets that we typically reposition because we're obviously a value-add orientated fund and investor. So we actually take older buildings as at that entry point.
That's sort of your specialty in a way.
Exactly. So, so for us, the whole repositioning kind of philosophy, we naturally inherit older buildings which have these challenges ahead. So we're certainly not scared of taking on these issues potentially. And actually, historically across the region, in any case, Blue House has been very open to sustainability even before ESG became a thing, particularly in sort of less developed markets, sort of Eastern and Southern European markets, where we became one of the first investors to implement BREEAM certifications in office buildings, etc. So as a concept, we're happy to embrace it. But there's definitely a current skepticism, let's call it, on the application of this new ESG kind of mindset and philosophy that's being approached across the market now. So long story short is that it's sort of naturally part of our business. We're aware of it. We're happy to embrace it. But there's still, from our opinion, definitely a lot more work and clarity needed for us to actually start implementing it correctly, because at the moment we're embracing the moral and ethical approach to it, but how we deliver this is a real open point.
Mm-hmm. Roland, talk a little bit about how you go about making the judgment of where your buildings are in relation to the current regulations, and formulating a strategy to do something about it. Do you have people in-house for this? Do you have local talent, or do you have to outsource that?
Actually, it's a combination. So basically, the portfolio which we have is quite big. So basically, would have to have quite a huge internal team dedicated to ESG only. So we have ESG people on board, which kind of coordinating mainly the external advisors. So basically, we still use the external advisors because we need them. We just need to get as much knowledge from the market as possible, which normally you are not able to get in-house unless you have really big team devoted to this topic only. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's a combination of external advisors and in-house people.
And Ian, for Blue House, how do you handle this?
Typically we use external advisors because we're very much project by project driven. So we don't actually have a huge in-house team dealing with that. However, it's also part of the culture within the organization as well. We've got a number of senior decision makers in Blue House, as I said before, understand and appreciate the ethical and moral logic behind sustainability. So it's driven from top down, but the actual application on the project is typically via external advisors as part of a project team.
Okay, Jan, perhaps let's bring you into this. How are you advising clients? I mean, what is the process, and what is it you're looking for when you go in and first start evaluating a building?
Well, we are the external advisor who works with a range of clients, ranging from tenants, landlords, and banks, the financing institutions. And most of what we do is driven by the financial institutions and their demands, gradually implementing whatever the EU legislation will take and will require. We are essentially looking into requirements that come from the term sheets of the either loans or refinancing terms, and those are gradually increasing demands in terms of what the building should be compliant to. Historically, it's been driven only by the energy performance certificate and perhaps the BREEAM certification. This is no longer sufficient. There are multiple other requirements that we need to look at. Location is very important to give a bit bigger picture about the building and where is it positioned. We are looking at operational aspects of the building, not just looking on the, let's say, how does it operate on paper, but the reality is typically quite different. So within the due diligence, whereas most of the investors are looking at the typical scope of technical due diligence, but there are certain bits and pieces coming into that DD, coming from this ESG realm, where we're analyzing impacts and mostly operational impacts, because all is around the operational carbon and potentially driving it to net zero operational carbon.
Let's take a step back. What is it building owners and asset managers have to keep in mind? How quickly do they have to figure out where their buildings are right now and then do something about it? And what is the looking from above? What sort of time frame are we looking at here, and what has to be achieved?
Well, most of the legislation, the European legislation, is supposed to come in force by 2030. So we have essentially something around 5 years to wrap our heads around it and find a pathway. How do we get to the compliance? After 2030, there is a gradual pathway of increasing the demands to net zero carbon until 2050. But especially the landlords and owners who have assets, let's say 15 years old, that's the best scheme now to start focusing on that building, because the usual useful life of technologies that drive most of the operational carbon and that what's coming into the DD to be assessed, they have 15 to 20 years of life expectancy. And since we have 5 years to go, 15-year-old building, that's the ideal target to start doing a feasibility study, trying to identify what CapEx is going to be needed, then to select the choice, design it, permit it, and then implement it by 2030. That would be the ideal scenario.
What is it exactly that has to happen by 2030? Buildings have to already be carbon neutral by then, or describe, because that 2030 is we keep hearing that date. What has to happen by then?
Well, definitely not carbon neutral. That would be too much to ask. That's 2050. But it's more about understanding where the building actually is, what its carbon footprint is, and there is a certain, let's say, benchmark that the building should be compliant to. It's based on the asset type, its age, composition of what the heat sources, for example, are, what the sources of electricity, cooling, etc. are, and it puts you somewhere on that scale, and you will find yourself either way above that line or below. If you're below, you're fine, and but you will you're incentivized by potential, let's say, negative taxation to lower your carbon footprint to net zero by 2050.
Okay, so by 2030, you have to know exactly where the building is. You have to have some kind of like a business plan, essentially, for that. And at that point, that's when the rubber meets the road. Companies can start getting extra taxes or fines placed upon them. So that's when it gets real, in a sense.
Yeah, you will have. This is going to be part of non-financial reporting towards the let's say, government or the authorities in terms of where you are, and based on that you will have this so-called taxation, if you're non-compliant.
Okay. And before we start getting into some of the other things that we're going to be taking a deep dive into, describe a bit about the process when you go in to look at a building. If you're commissioned by an asset owner to come in and help them start this process, how long does it take? How many people do this? From your team, just physically, how does it actually happen?
Well, as I said, this forms usually part of technical due diligence as an, let's say, annex, as a ESG DD or as a ESG assessment. So it's a broader team of, let's say, 5 to 6 specialists who analyze the building from the architectural structural aspects to the HVAC and the environmental impacts. And what is, from the ESG perspective, as our first focus is obviously the energy performance certificate and how the building is evaluated in that document. But we need to understand that EPC is sort of an artificial view of the building to assess all the buildings on the same level. For example, that you're heating to 20 centigrade, in the interior temperature, but this is not the case. We're typically, heating higher. So we then have to look at the invoices for, whatever utilities you're using in the building, They have certain factor of, let's say, carbon emissions, so we can calculate the carbon footprint. We have multiple other aspects coming into place, like how you treat waste, whether you're reusing rainwater, the architectural, structural things, which means whatever the facade is, roof is, and how the building is generally positioned in all these other aspects, and whether it has a potential to be, let's say, easily renovatable, to bring it on a higher level, and what the potential risks are. Yeah.
Okay. Roland, you're obviously seeing a lot of these recommendations, either from your own team or from outside investors. What are the items that are of biggest concern that you need to have prepared by 2030, but also going forward?
Basically, I would just need to repeat the same thing that Jan mentioned. It's all about the operations. So basically, you have to make sure that all your building management systems, your heating, your cooling, you are using the right energy. So basically, buying green energy instead of heating with gas or other. Not speaking about coal, but of course the other stuff. Maybe looking for a way how to install photovoltaics and other stuff, which basically can lower the consumption of sources of energy which are not considered to be green.
Those are sort of the easy wins. That's the low-hanging fruit in a way. That's something you can do something about immediately.
You can do it immediately, but of course there is the price behind it, which is not really an easy thing to swallow for all the investors, because it can be pretty expensive. Mm-hmm. And as you indicated at the very beginning, so we might be speaking, when you want to move the building from, let's say, D, which is non-compliant at the moment, to C level, for a building which is 15 years old, which is not an old building. So basically we have buildings which are 50, 100 years old within the Prague. So for building of 15 years of age, it can easily be €500 per square meter and more. So imagine you have a standard building of, let's say, 20,000 square meters, which is the usual size of an office building. So you have to invest €10 million just to make sure that you will move it by one grade. And as Jan will mention maybe in a second, these grades are not set. So basically it's going to move within the time. So basically you will move it now, and within 5 years' time, you will realize that you will no longer be able to get and keep the grade. So you will have to do again something, which is again will drive substantial investment. So
the unfortunate thing is that it's I would say it's not clear for the owners what they have to do and where they actually are. Because if you look at the EPC at the moment, the energy performance certificate, it gives you some letter of the class, and behind that letter you have certain, let's say, energy consumption per square meter. But that's a number that's hard to imagine what it actually means. The rest of the rest of Europe usually has on the EPC the carbon footprint, like how much, let's say, grams of kilograms of CO2 you're having produced per square meter, which is much better metrics in assessing that. But until the EPBD4 legislation is coming into force, which is by 2028, we're not going to have the EPCs in Czech Republic modified, so it includes this number. So, and everything is going to be driven by this to get it to net zero carbon, to, let's say, this number to zero. And the other thing is, most of the people perceive it the way, like, how can we get a building with, let's say, gas-powered heating to net zero carbon? Because it's gas-powered, there's always going to be a carbon. Well, you have multiple ways of looking at it. So the building itself doesn't have to be net zero carbon. It can offset some of the carbon that it's producing by another means, where the easiest is, let's say, I'm usually saying, like, buy a land and grow a forest and store the carbon over there. But there are these means that you can do in terms of offsetting the things. It doesn't mean that all the buildings have to go electric by 2030 or by then.
You guys planning to build forests, or what's your way forward? No,
absolutely not. The way forward is, the way forward, like I said, is it's challenging, and this is like the kind of theoretical issue that I have with it, is that most landlords are being very pragmatic about this. Getting the decarbonisation pathway, getting your EPC certificate statement up to certain levels is something that all landlords are doing, and I think this gives you a very good photo of where the asset sits today. The problem is taking that to the finish line, and if we don't know what that finishing line is, why suddenly go on this pathway? This is the issue. We can all take a view of the assets today, which I think most landlords, pragmatic values, are doing. This is something that we have to do. But the issue is, at what point do you press the button to start? Given what Roland said, the cost of actually initiating a lot of these, these upgrades to your building is immense on paper. It's immense. So I think actually the most pragmatic way of doing this is doing the low-hanging fruit, which is more of a defensive move, I think, actually, from most landlords, because it's actually what we should be doing. Okay, we should be replacing LED lighting. We should be making sure the building is operating, to certain standards and regulations, etc. So these things the landlords are doing, I think. The issue is it's the big works. And my sort of concern when we have this photograph taken of the asset, when we have the reports from the advisors, which we are doing on every asset, it's the usual initiatives that are coming out to get your big ticks, which is you need a new facade. It's like, okay, wonderful. We just 3 years ago replaced our facade at Novo Plaza, and then the report said you need a new facade. It's like, well, it just appears to be very sort of inputs go in, and then there's an output that comes out, and that's your thing.
You just replaced the facade. On what basis did you make the decision to pick a particular facade?
Because the building was old. Honestly, we knew it had to be done.
But I mean, the specifications of it. I mean, when you looked at it,
there was an existing facade on the building. We didn't rip the facade off and put a brand new one on. Of course, you don't do that. You make localized upgrades, etc. You do you upgrade parts of the facade. But in essence, at that point in time, it absolutely fell into check norms and what was typical on the market at that point. And then, 3 years later, you get a report saying, quite kind of broad brush report saying you need to do these 3 initiatives, which is building insulation. Yeah, we get that. We know we have to insulate the building. But to replace a full facade and things like that, this is something which I think we need to be a hell of a lot more nuanced on, particularly from the reporting and actually the application of this. And so this is where I feel there's a bit of a gap, that what we see, is one thing, but then actually there needs to be some kind of pragmatic step process to do that. And okay, if we do need to upgrade a certain part of the building, to do this all by 2030 without actually knowing the real implication from sort of regulatory attacks, even market benchmarks, is a tough decision to make as an asset manager. And honestly, we sit and wait on these big calls, and we monitor and we wait. And I think this is sort of how we do it. We do the defensive works. And if we need to do a big particular project, whether it's a facade roof or new entrance areas or technology upgrades, we do that on the basis that it's maintaining the long-term value inherently, not because of a certain cliff or, pinch point that's coming from a regulatory perspective. So,
Roland, how many of these investments that we're talking about, for example, in the building management system that can be made, do those not have a pretty quick impact potentially on sort of the value of your building in a way?
Not directly on the value of the building, so because there is a long way to get it into the value of the building. But I just wanted to re-emphasize what Jan just said, and Ian as well. But basically, it's all about the management first. So basically, if you have a proper management of the building that is able to work with the utilities and technology you have already installed, it's cheap, it's pretty much without any investment, but you can save plenty of money over there. So that's really the first step that you have to take. You have to be sure that you have a proper property manager in place that is able and basically understands how the building management system works. That's the first thing. Second thing is, of course, when you have done that, then you have to look at the technology and other stuff which you would like to implement, and you can implement for a reasonable amount of money, because that's, again, we will be discussing that again and again. Someone has to pay for that. And when speaking about these savings on the service charges, it takes a lot of time until you transfer the saving from service charges into the rent and then increase the value of the building. We might be speaking about 5 years, maybe even longer, because you have to renegotiate the leases which you have in place just to be able to materialize on the fact that basically, guys, I've saved plenty money on those service charges, so I can charge you higher rent. Tenants will never look at rent and service charges. They are looking at accommodation costs. So basically, they are looking at the number, how much I am going to pay to be in that building. And either it's rent or service charge, I don't care.
But I would think that why does that not make it immediately possible to transfer instead of your tenants paying more on energy, they can pay more on rent? Or that's not you.
That's impossible.
It sounds really easy. So tell me why that's not possible.
It's illegal, basically. So basically,
well, I mean, not that you would enforce it, but that you could sit down with your clients and say, we all have these green aims. How would you like to? I can help you pay less on your energy costs. I need to compensate that with more with higher rent charges. Why is that not a win-win?
Because they have a valid lease contract in place, and they will never want to change it basically it's not in their favor. Why would they do that?
Because I don't see why is it against them? If they're going to pay the same if they're going to have the same overall costs.
Of course, but what they do, basically they will say, okay, perfect, that's good to hear that you did it. Next time when we speak about the prolongation of the lease, we can take that into consideration. But we are not going to open any discussion on lease until the lease is close to the maturity.
But I thought they all have corporate green goals.
They will push for that, but they do not want to pay for that. Exactly. That's a big difference. And the market perceives that tenants want something and they want to pay for that. It's not like that. They want it, but they do not want to pay for that immediately. Maybe in the long run they will, but for the moment they just push you and will even blackmail you. If you do not invest into the building, basically we will leave. And when you come to the prolongation discussion, they will say, okay, perfect, so we'll decrease the rent by €1, because otherwise we will go into your competition, we will discuss with your competition, and we will move there. So it's actually working against you. But if you don't do that, you're screwed anyway, but you have to do it. But again, when it comes to prolongation, you have to be in a very good position to be able to capitalize on those investments, because there is always some kind of competition that will go after your neck.
Ian, are they really so unidealistic, these tenants?
Of course they are. I mean, money talks, right? And when you come to your lease renewal negotiation, you sit down with the tenant, you go, okay, look at the last 3 years of our service charge regime. You know, we've managed to give you savings on A, B, C, D, and E, etc. But ultimately, they go, yeah, very nice, thank you, but sorry, corporate approval, we can only now pay you X rent. You know, this is the sort of discussion you have, and they are not only interested. Obviously, the financials of the lease prolongation is critical. It's decision number one in their mindset. The kind of sustainability element is a nice to have, but it's about maximizing their all-in costs as much. So they're going to use it against the landlord in any typical negotiation. So I just feel that it's something that you can't crystallize immediately. As Roland said, you've got to wait for the lease renewal to have that discussion. Then when you are at that point in time, they easily forget about all the good work you've done, and they squeeze you as hard as they can. And that's the game, right? And that's what we have to ensure. So ultimately, the landlords pay for this. If you want to implement such ways, if you want to demonstrate OPEX savings, you want to invest all in this, the landlord has to pay.
What are you telling your clients who own these buildings that they should be doing? Obviously, they have to figure out their building management systems and all that. But if their facade is not compliant, what do you tell them to do? Do you say, I mean, is it tough luck for them, or do they have to, like, how are they supposed to square that circle?
Well, the facade is the last thing they should be focusing on, right? Consider that Masaryčka has a 20 million euro facade, so you don't want to be replacing that anytime soon. And the life cycle of a facade is 30 plus years. Mm-hmm. The technologies are 15 plus years, so you're going to change them twice before you change the facade. So again, as said before, look at the operational thing. As Roland said, you have to have property managers and facility managers who know their stuff. They operate it well. They have certain procedures to do this correctly. Have an external view on the consumption, whether it's in, let's say, some sort of a benchmark range of where it should be and whether you should focus it on somehow. But and then you could gradually do some more detailed assessments. But for example, we worked for CA Immo on 2 assets, which was Nile House and Danube House, where we changed the glazing panels in the interior atrium facade because it made huge savings. We improved the properties by 50%. The expense wasn't as great, and it's going to be yielding, let's say, the return is like 4 to 5 years. So, but it needs a proper assessment to this and proper approach, and no one would have thought that changing this would actually improve the building as much and the consumption. So. Look at the different aspects, spend those couple of thousands of euros on these assessments because it will at least shed some light on where you are, and you can then take and let's say educated decision on what the next steps are. And I think that what's sort of typical on this market that capex planning is done, let's say 1, maximum 2 years ahead, but that's not going to be sufficient anymore. We will have to look 3+, 5+ years ahead, at least in very general terms, sort of looking at what those systems and components of the buildings are, what it could generally cost, and start like shifting your mindset in this more long-term planning. That's not where that's where I don't see our clients as much. It's still like it's September, October time. Let's plan for next year only.
But isn't that the kind of the issue we were talking about before? Is that we don't really have clarity what's happening in 3 to 10 years, and so we can plan for it. Great, we all have sort of 5 to 10 year capex plans, but the reality is,
I think that
we have to make that decision at that time, not today.
I think that we know what has to be done. It's more about when. We know that we should be net zero carbon by some time, and we don't know how fast do we have to go there. But generally having a plan in your drawer to be able to pick it out and start implementing it, that would be the wise choice to do, wise decision.
That's why we do it. Basically, we do 5 years rolling plan for CapEx. And basically, it consists all the things you just mentioned, and which makes sense, even if it costs millions of euros. It's on the plan. So basically, so everyone can see it, and it's mentioned there. So basically, then the investor can be thinking about implementing. It doesn't have to be implemented. There are certain priorities to each and every line, but we want investor or landlord to know that this might happen or might be needed in the near future. Near future, we might be speaking 3 to 5 years. But coming back to this facade issue, because that's something for me which I cannot really understand, because I've seen many reports coming from many advisors that we need to replace facade on the building. Facade is 15 years old. Can you imagine how much carbon you would have to create to build a new facade, to take it down, to handle the waste, and like all the process around it, which is not calculated anywhere in that formula. So basically, it would create so much emissions, changing the facade, basically, that will never ever be saved by the replacement of the existing and working facade. It's not like facade that is falling down.
Yeah, and that's a good thing that you mentioned it, because everyone is focusing on operational carbon, but no one is really focused on the embedded carbon into the construction of it. But again, coming back to these CAIMO projects, we only replaced the glazing panels, and those could be recycled like almost 100%, which is great. And it decreased the footprint of doing that change. So I wouldn't scare everyone about like replacing the facade as a whole. You could use, let's say, the bearing structure of the facade and replace certain elements within what you probably done on the Novo Plaza, because it improves locally. And if you consider that these, let's say, non-transparent parts of the facade are typically 10 times better than the glazed parts, you have to focus on the glazed parts. Those are the biggest, let's say, leakage of heat. And
for people who are not sort of construction and building experts, just how problematic is, how expensive is it, and what does it do to the bottom line to have to suddenly replace it? I mean, what I'm hearing is that at some point you're going to have to make a replacement or serious improvements to the facade at some point after, I don't know if it's 20 or if it's 30 years. I think every homeowner knows they're going to have to do that. They count on that. It's not going to ruin any of them, or it shouldn't. But is the issue that you're being told you might have to do it in 2030 when it's just completely out of the normal financially structured life cycle of an asset?
Basically, this specific request was if you want to move from D to C, basically you have to change the facade, which is perfectly working, fully functional. But basically, as Jan said, it cannot really comply with the fact that basically you have a glass facade and then you have this non-transparent facade. But if you do a non-transparent facade, basically then you have a big problem with lighting. So basically, you will be not hygiene compliant. So basically, then you cannot have the office inside. This is something which people kind of are not thinking, or I'm just thinking. Okay, we can do it. We can do small windows, but then you have no lights coming in. Basically, there is no hygiene approval. Basically, you cannot use it. So
tenants will not want it.
Then tenants will not want it. Not speaking about the fact that basically if you want to change the facade, you have to make the building vacant. So all the tenants have to go out, you change the facade and they will not come back. You have to release the building again from the scratch. So it will create a huge void and the building will be vacant for 2-3 years. Who's going to pay the rent? Who's going to pay the debt service?
Sometimes even more expensive than the facade.
Exactly.
And this is again about the kind of the outputs of what we're being told to do at the moment. I mean, I hate the word stranding, which comes out of every single one. And there's a nice diagram in every of these reports where there's a cross point when your building hits that stranding point, and it's normally pretty soon. And you're thinking, okay, well, we do all this work, but to be honest, I feel that if you want to strand the building, replace the facade, empty your building out, and struggle to release it for 36 months, that's a stranded building, right? Not something which is actually functional, operatable, and leased, and just doesn't happen to tick the boxes today. So I think the definition of what really is stranding has to be really defined from an industry perspective. Certainly from an industry perspective, an empty building which might be fully ESG compliant on a regulation which we don't quite know yet, versus this is where we have to be a bit more sort of kind of we have to categorize or be more nuanced, or the industry has to evolve a little bit more so we can kind of find that balance point.
We need a taxonomy of stranded.
And stranding is an opportunity for someone else, right? So to add value where he knows best. And that's where the long-term planning is coming in, because it can drive the decision for the owners to potentially dispose of those buildings because they don't fit into their portfolios and the way they operate. And I believe that this will drive certain movement on the investment market, because some owners will dispose of certain buildings because they just don't have the internal, workforce or processes to actually implement the change, and they will be looking at a newer stock to let someone else do it.
We're talking about in terms of in 2030, these regulations will start really biting. But that doesn't mean they're not having an impact already on your day-to-day life. I assume, especially when it comes to financing, refinancing of assets. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. That's very much right. Because when speaking now about the refinancing, or you hit the spot, basically your loan will expire, then you cannot really prolong the loan within the Czech Republic with a reputable bank unless you have report that is going to be produced by Jan or someone else. So you have to have an assessment in place which will say, okay, the building is okay, or it is going to be okay after 5 years, where usually the loans are granted for 5 years. And without the document, basically the bank cannot categorize the loan as a green one. So basically they might give you financing, but they will have to downgrade the financing, thus the margin is not going to be much nicer, and then it's going to be immediately more expensive. So basically what you need to do, you have to put some money aside, and bank will force you to create some kind of CapEx plan or CapEx reserve account on which you have to deposit the money, and you have to have a plan which we will prepare, or Jan will prepare for the bank, and you have to start to implement these issues or these matters as soon as possible. And without that, basically the bank will say, sorry, we cannot loan you. So,
and the bank is asked recently how the bank is going to incentivize, and I sort of thought it's going to be, let's say, lower interest if you are ESG compliant, but actually it's simpler, because they're going to, let's say, prolong the loan term, and therefore allow for easier cash flow for you to pay for these investments, right? So that's what the lenders have to realize, that this is going to be part of the change, that they will ease up on those, let's say, repayments of the loan to allow for those investments.
Yeah, we've had two sort of recent examples of this, and actually I think the banks are quite open to be quite commercially minded about this.
They're being pragmatic in it, or
very
constructive,
pragmatic.
shall we
Exactly,
say?
and this is the bit that gives me a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel here, is that yes, it's been driven by the financing banks, but they're being very practical in how they are sort of dealing with the borrowers on this. And we've had one recent, basically we've applied for additional tranche. It is to cover capex, refinance capex that has been spent over the last sort of 24 months. And it's sort of the way that they're absolutely open to lend, so long as there's a tangible plan, which in this situation we've actually implemented the plan, we're just getting it refinanced. But the end conclusion is, by X certain period of time we have to get to an EPC rating. And this is how they're doing it. But they're giving us enough time. They're not saying you have to do it by the end of the year. They're giving us a certain time.
They're giving you
frame.
enough time for what? To make the first step, or
in our case, we've already done the step, and it's about refinancing. But then the idea is we've got some additional works to implement, and then we will apply for a higher EPC rating. But they've basically bookended the loan on the basis that this is the only condition subsequent to the top-up loan, is you need to get to this level by this date. But it's long enough to definitely get there. It's not like they're putting you under pressure. So they're being pragmatic. They're trying to get what they want and allowing the landlord to actually have the time to deliver that. Right. So that's on one top-up loan. And then on a new loan, we actually have managed to get the LTV higher on the basis that a CapEx loan is implemented into the acquisition loan as well. So we're actually getting a larger loan amount. So, and this is up by, we're talking 2 million plus extra loan on the basis that it's going to be recycled back into the asset. Mm-hmm. And there's no sort of conditional to this, but they're seeing this as, okay, we're now putting a loan on this asset for 5 years. We need to know the value of this asset is going to be sustained. So here's your additional loan, but you have to spend it on the building.
Exactly. Banks needs to be pragmatic, because otherwise, if they would stop lending or prolonging the loans, there would be full Armageddon immediately. But you have to take into consideration that all the properties having some difficulties when it comes to interest, because it's much higher than it used to be. We can remember the negative rates, and majority of those negative rates will end, or actually has ended this year. Mm-hmm. So all the financing now have moved from, let's say, the overall costs for a good building in Prague were 150, 160. And now it has moved to 500, 600. So basically you are now, the debt service is under a huge pressure. And on top of that, you have to reserve some money, which is going to be invested into the building for these changes. So basically the cash flow of those projects is really on the edge. So banks needs to be pragmatic, otherwise the majority of their portfolio would need to go into some kind of workout.
It's in their interests as well. Are you finding that approach is typical?
Yeah, it is. And we need to realize that the banks cannot be super strict at the moment. One thing that's coming into play, that they are still mapping their portfolios of the existing loans and sort of where they are and how green their portfolios are. And they're forming their strategies as well on the go. So, but it's getting stricter and stricter. They are getting more clarity in this. However, when we do quite a lot of bank monitoring stuff for new development, and we can see the increased demands that we are supposed to confirm some assumptions from the term sheets or the loan agreement, that whether those have been complied to, and it's a stricter topic. Originally a couple of years ago, it was just about risks about the contractor, whether the budget is feasible, whether we have a permit, that's it. But nowadays it shifts towards this, let's say, sustainability or ESG topic.
Ultimately, what makes this so tricky is that at some point, these regulations are having a sudden and potentially dramatic impact on the valuations of property. Is that happening already?
Yes, we have to take it into consideration. So basically, we don't see that directly in the valuation at the moment. But when you would go out to the market now and you basically want to sell a building which is 10, 15, 20 years old, most likely that what would happen, that the buyer would ask you, okay, would hire Jan, and Jan would come up with some nice list of things which needs to be implemented, and that might be a deduction from the purchase price. Mm-hmm. So that's a quick fix, and that would allow the future owner of the asset to create this capex reserve, mm-hmm. which basically the owner doesn't have to pay to the seller. So basically it's the money that goes aside, and those money are then spent on those modifications that will improve the rating of the building. So basically saying that you either will do it on your own, or you will get a price deduction when you want to exit the property.
You're looking at this as both an opportunity and a problem, in a sense, in that
yes.
you own property, but you're also looking to pick up properties?
Absolutely. I was going back to what Jan said before. I mean, there will be funds which simply they don't have the capacity or desire to basically implement various ESG strategy or sustainability strategy, and they'll put it to the market, but that it will come at a huge discount because of the costs involved to reposition. I mean, that's the simple thing. So that might happen, but I mean, I think that's very much a case-by-case situation. I don't think that's going to be a huge wave, but we see it both as a challenge as an existing landlord and an opportunity. But the thing is, though, it's not really an opportunity per se because of still the unknowns. Because actually, when we are analysing a building, for example, an office building which is, 20 years old, right? How long is a bit of string with regards to the cost involved into that? I mean, we looked at one building where I think the range was something 8 to 10 million euros, which has to come straight off the acquisition price, and then the seller's just like looking at you, going, "Are you serious?" We calculated this. We have a report that says it's 3 million. So you have a report that says 8 to 10. They have a report 3 million. Deal. They just don't. There's too big a gap to bridge. So there's challenges even when you're looking at the opportunities because of the still. I'm not saying lack of clarity, but it's.
But you guys always want certainty. There's no certainty there for you, essentially.
There is no certainty.
Exactly that. No. But no, exactly.
Even the ways how the LOIs are going to be negotiated when coming into the deal, and since we are in this area or era of, let's say, de-risking the assets prior to sale, we're working, I would say 50% of our due diligence work is on vendor due diligence, preparing the asset for sale to have a smooth process, not to burn anyone's time and money on unsuccessful acquisitions. And so the LOIs are going to be redefined to account for these aspects way more and more, because those conditions will be checked in the DD, and those will be, let's say, challenged within the DD, and then sales purchase price discounts will be asked for. And we're currently working on a sale of a big portfolio, office and retail, and it hasn't been negotiated in the LOI. The ESG is going to form a big part of it, but still we are getting some requests on certain compliances because the future buyer is looking at what they're going to do with the buildings and whether elementary things are correct and compliant, and all the different specifics, the details they will be then dealing with on their own. But I think that we might be sounding quite negative. The bottom line is everyone wants to do this change. It's more about we're scratching our heads on how do we find that fund that transition into that net zero carbon era. That's more of a problem, and we need to find that money somewhere. It's with the tenants who have to pay for it to allow the landlords to do this transition.
But I think it also shows how polarized the whole kind of methodology is on this, because we're talking about the capital market situation, which as an owner, when we're talking about a defensive approach, we are doing this prior to exiting a building. We make sure we've got all the compliance and everything, because it's defensive, because we don't want the price deductions. So this is what landlords are doing at the moment. But this is the easy stuff. And then you have the more complex stuff, which needs to be done long term, which is the open point. And so we have these two kind of paths on the process. You've got the easy, low-hanging fruit per se, and try to protect immediate value, and then you've got the items which you need to protect the value long term, which is the big question mark, in my opinion.
Maybe just to put it into perspective of absolute numbers, because I think what Ian just mentioned, we're speaking about the numbers, which is like you said 3, and the other side wanted 5 to 8 to 10, but we are in millions of euros anyway. If it is just 3, it's quite a lot of money. And what I've seen recently, basically, we see that the deduction might come to 5 to 10% of the purchase price, which is like dramatic amount of money that needs to be discounted or deducted from the purchase price. No one wants to do that. It kills the performance of the funds, and someone needs to pay for that. But I just don't see anyone who would be willing to take the bill. Funds will not do that because that would kill their profitability. We agreed that tenants are not going to pay for that. That's most likely not the case. Not now, maybe in 5 years or time it might change. And who else is there? So basically, who is going to drive the change? Who is going to pay for this transformation?
I mean, I think it is important to say, Jan, as you mentioned, that I don't think anyone around this table, and frankly anybody in the property industry, has anything against the ideals of the Green Deal. I don't think I think most people active today with families and thinking about the future want these things to come about. The issue that I hear all the time from a lot of people in the real estate sector is that these regulations are being implemented upon them essentially as goals that should be achieved, but it hasn't been done with feedback and input from the industry's professionals that are going to be impacted and have to implement it.
Exactly. Basically, we are speaking about the buildings which are 15, 20 years old. But what about the stock which we have in Prague or everywhere else, which is 50 years old? Mm-hmm. What are we going to do with those buildings? There's no way that you would be able to transfer them into C class. Basically, you have to demolish them, or you are not able to use them. Or basically, these buildings definitely will be E or worse. And okay, take the UK example. So basically, you will not be allowed to rent those buildings to third parties. That's the UK regulation, which is now coming into force. So are we going to adopt the same thing? So basically, if that's the case, then we have only 2 options. Either we demolish or we will convert into something else. Basically, that would not require this type of scoring. So I have no answer to that, but it's really crazy.
I think it's more the we're being beaten by the stick. There's no real carrot at the moment, and this is the concern. And yeah, I mean, God knows what's going to happen to Prague 1 in 2030. I mean, you're telling me that we're suddenly going to have a whole load of photovoltaic panels stuck on the roofs of buildings in Prague 1.
The monument officials won't allow
absolutely, that. Exactly. So it's just, I just think there appears to be no pragmatic vision from the regulatory perspective, and it's like, okay, you need to do this, off you go and do it, without really having a more pragmatic and thought processes involved.
Prague 1 might be okay because it's a cultural heritage, so
just blame
that should be fine because that's always an exemption from EU taxonomy. But Prague 2, Prague 3, Prague 4, Prague 5, Prague 6.
Yeah, but not everything is the heritage, right? So heritage protected. So a lot of sort of stranded assets will be there, and what are we going to do with it? So I don't have an answer to that, and it's sort of similar to phasing out fossil fuels with cars. It's a great idea, but how do we actually do it that every villager is going to have an electric car and we're going to have electric trucks and everything? It's hard to see how do we achieve that, and there is going to have to be some some incentivification in terms of doing that, which whether it's some subsidies for the sustainable development, but obviously I'm not a fan of subsidies because it damages the market because it doesn't work on its own and under its own principles. But
there needs to be
current principles show that
like
we're not moving to that quickly.
Well, I think it has to come along the lines of this, because you need something to stimulate the kind of the commercial market. Because if you think about, even in the times we're in now, the macroeconomic situation, this isn't the economic time to invest heavily without, everyone is cash conscious. Everyone is, looking at trying to optimize. And so then to be sort of given this initiative where you have to invest heavily in this economic environment is not easy, so then we need something to stimulate things.
It's a very tricky situation because, there's a lot at stake. It's not just, the money of your investors and the people and the industry that at stake. There's also the environment at stake. There's also sort of the future that I think everybody now takes quite seriously in terms of the seriousness of climate change. On the other hand, and I think this is what I am quite concerned about, is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There's a lot of excellent goals that we have, but by forcing industries to go too quickly, I think the danger is the backlash. We've just watched elections happen in my home country, in which I think to a certain extent, you can see what happens when a society gets over its skis, when it takes on more than it can chew in a way that's really been accepted by everybody. Someone's going to have to take a hit, but I think that has to be spread around in some way between the industry, there has to be a recognition that this doesn't come free and this doesn't come simply because investors will throw a bunch of money and ruin themselves.
Yeah, the best the government could do is some sort of a tax exemption, that not to pay taxes on real estate for some time to allow for these investments to happen. But can we allow for that in our budget that's already 300 billion Czech crowns in deficit, and that underlined by the fact of change in the lead in US and potential pullback on the Green Deal on the global scheme, it may impact these things. So it brings another level of uncertainty to the market, and therefore reluctance on the investor side and landlord side to transition to this change quickly, and that will slow things down. Yeah.
When speaking about politics, we have to understand one fact. Basically, we're speaking that someone needs to take the bill. What's going to happen if theoretically you are able to transfer the rent, increase the rent into with your tenants? So basically what's going to happen? They will reflect the rent in their pricing, which ultimately will lead into more expensive goods which you are going to buy in a grocery shop. Mm-hmm. It's going to be transferred everywhere. So are we able to handle that? Because we've seen many populist guys coming around saying that this is too expensive, that is too expensive. It's going to be much more expensive if we do that. There's no good solution to that.
Yeah, I'm just not convinced it's the right time to implement it. Even for the average guy on the street, it's not the right time.
Am I crazy to think that there are investors out there who are saying, this is so unpragmatic that I'm just going to wait around and see if there's actually going to be these fines placed on companies for not matching it by, say, 2030, 2031?
Yeah, exactly.
It seems to be a sort of an unspoken subtext to the discussions that I hear and the plans that investors outside of some that are making these changes. But who knows if you can count on that?
Some of the people are left with no other choice because they simply don't have the means to fund it. So they're simply going to wait and wait for the hit if it's going to come and when it's going to come.
Well, and there's a big if. Still, and this is actually fueling the mindset of that, is that because there is this big question mark still. So
that's the biggest flaw from my perspective in the politics, that they should create an environment with fixed terms, whatever they are, but this uncertainty brings lower rating to our economy and therefore again fueling the egress of the Western money from our market.
I'm certainly not an expert on these things, but to me, what the fundamental issue that I see is that there's not a recognition of the embedded carbon that we've been speaking about. That if you're looking at a choice of having to tear down a building and replace it, and figure out some way to grandfather in existing buildings in terms of giving maybe a longer timeline to implement these things. For example, to the end of the normal life cycle of a facade. It just seems like that there's a bunch of restrictions that have been come in and indicators that buildings now have to achieve so that they're on some level carbon neutral, but that just doesn't take into account, almost in an accounting way, the embedded carbon that's already there that doesn't need to be replaced.
That's 100% true.
Well, I'm happy to hear when it's final the story of Skanska and Mercuria, demolishing, trying to recycle whatever they can. And how does it end up, and whether someone calculates the whole carbon footprint story of this transition, because it is going to be like a good case study for these potential changes elsewhere, whether it has or hasn't been successful, and how is it going to change their build costs and what they will have to translate into their rents.
I think it's all about hearing about recycling. But this is recycling of something which works. And you do not have to do the recycling process, which again will incur plenty of carbon if you do that. So for me, this does not make any sense.
I guess from my side, to the extent that these regulations have been put in without sort of feedback from the industry itself, I think there still should be an opportunity for actual dialogue with people within the industry to come up with some type of creative ways, constructive ways that might actually have more of a potential positive impact. But it takes some type of an open dialogue.
Absolutely. I mean, this is this. I appreciate it. It's a highly complicated thing to implement. Taking the theory into practical application. It's highly complicated, but it needs something, because at the moment there's this sort of question mark out there. If it's a level of having certain exemptions, if there's a level of having categorizations on age and location, there needs to be something which kind of helps. Not. It is, because everyone's put in the same basket, and that's the issue. We need to be put into different baskets, so we at least then we're able to kind of do it asset by asset, location by location, building type by building type, and then that's maybe a more clear pathway. Then you've sort of got something a bit more sophisticated to follow. But I don't know if it's...
I want to fuel the negativity, but considering the location, like, we are still sort of talking about Prague market, and even that's difficult. But can you imagine the regional cities? The build costs are still the same almost throughout the Czech Republic. They don't really change much, but the rent levels are quite different. And so if anywhere, we have to start seeing the change in Prague. But what happens with Pilsen, and these regional cities and these office buildings that are C-class, and how they move up in the scale, that's going to be another challenge, and it's sort of outside our focus and what we perceive as the typical commercial real estate sector. But having some case studies, let's say, from the government, from the regularities, and showing the buildings what it could be done to bring them to compliance with some numbers, timelines, etc., as a cookbook, for someone to follow, as an example. That would be good if some experts spend their time and obviously some resource in creating these case studies.
And ultimately, you need to understand that it's not we won't get this now, but at some point in the near future or the midterm, we need to understand the penalties and the negative implications if we don't. Yeah. Because at the moment, there's definitely a sit and wait approach. And if you don't have the financial means is actually a very good point, because even if you have the desire to do it, you don't have the financial means, what can you do? And I think this is something which the EU or passed down to the governments need to tell us.
given the amount of money which we're speaking about, it might be easier for all the landlords to sit and wait and pay additional fines and taxes, because it might be way cheaper than doing the investment. I just do not want to be too pessimistic, but actually that might be the case.
No, exactly. And that is an option.
That is one of the options. But I think the strong pushback might come soon, because as we discussed, basically this is not transformed into Czech legislation yet. So we know the guidelines from European Union, but when we start the process of implementation of these changes into Czech legislation, I think and I guess there is going to be a strong pushback, because then the industry will understand that this is real. For the moment, it's not real for the industry.
Well, I appreciate you guys coming out and speaking about this so openly, because I think to a certain extent, most companies are forced in their brochures and in their public announcements to talk about how green they want to be, because everybody wants to be green. But it has been interesting, given the severity of the problems or the issues or the challenges that are coming up, that there has not been more dialogue about this, that there hasn't been more outcry from the sector. So I'm glad to see this and commend you on your courage to speak out.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So I guess we'll wrap it up with that. I'd like to thank you all just once again for taking part, and hopefully it'll be interesting for everyone watching this to the bitter end.
Thank you for having us.
Okay,
Thank you for having us.
great.
Thank you also.